Have you ever tried to argue with someone and realized it was like talking to a wall? Have you ever felt that no matter how much logic, patience, or even compassion you use, some people seem immune to reason? Well, know this: that's nothing new. Great thinkers throughout history have reflected deeply on how to deal with fools, the stubborn, the arrogant, and the ignorant. In this video, you'll learn 15 smart strategies against stupidity, based on centuries of philosophical wisdom. And be careful, you might discover that stupidity isn't only in other people. Epictetus, one of the great voices of Stoicism, wrote in the Enchiridion, "It's not things that upset us, but our judgments about things." For the Stoic, wisdom isn't about changing the other person, something we almost never manage to do. It's about mastering yourself. Patience, then, isn't weakness. It's an inner strength that protects your rational integrity in the middle of external chaos. It's an intellectual virtue because it keeps the mind from being dragged around by impulse. A lot of people think patience is just a moral trait, something calm people have. But it's also a thinking tool. It keeps us from reacting on autopilot, allows us to notice patterns of error, and, most importantly, lets us learn from other people's stupidity without getting infected by it. When we respond to stupidity with rage or contempt, we're basically admitting we can't stay centered. And as Epictetus would say, that's surrender. Because the moment we lose self-control, we hand the other person the power to pull us out of reason. And that's the real failure of a thinking mind. History is full of great minds who were provoked, attacked, or mocked, but stayed steady. Think of Socrates, who chose to drink hemlock rather than abandon his commitment to reason. Or modern figures like Viktor Frankl, who, even inside concentration camps, kept his inner clarity. In cases like these, patience was more than a virtue. It was philosophical resistance. We live in an age of instant reactions. Social media feeds the idea that the fastest comeback is the smartest one. But that's an illusion. The rush to respond often shows more vanity than wisdom. A patient philosopher doesn't sprint to reply. He watches to understand. And understanding takes time, maturity, and inner silence. Epictetus pushes us to shift the focus. Instead of trying to change other people, we should use difficult situations to shape our own character. That way, every encounter with someone else's ignorance becomes training for the soul, a testing ground for strengthening our own reason. A powerful example of patience as an intellectual virtue is Nelson Mandela. Imprisoned for 27 years for fighting apartheid in South Africa, he had every reason to live with hatred, bitterness, and a desire for revenge. But what did he do? He walked out willing to talk, to forgive, to rebuild. Many criticized him for being too patient with his former oppressors. But Mandela understood something essential. Patience is not passivity. It's moral strategy. It's proof that reason can outweigh impulse. He turned suffering into maturity, injustice into emotional intelligence. When you look at his journey, you see that patience isn't just putting up with people. It's seeing beyond the moment, beyond a wounded ego. That requires a philosophical sense of time, a trust that real good is built slowly, not through screaming matches, but through quiet, conscious choices. Stupidity, as irritating as it is a test. It forces us to practice what we claim to know, because it's easy to look wise when everyone agrees with you. The hard part is staying clear-headed when someone says something deeply wrong, and says it with total confidence. But that's the opportunity. Every encounter with a fool can become an informal classroom, and the lesson is simple. How you respond to what you can't control reveals how much you control yourself. Patience, then, is a kind of intelligence measured not by the words you say, but by the words you choose not to say. It's the space between stimulus and response. And in that space, as Viktor Frankl said, lies the power of choice and therefore freedom. Today, when opinions crash into each other like cars at high speed, cultivating patience has become almost revolutionary. Political polarization, pointless arguments online, comments full of hate, Everything shows a deep lack of philosophical maturity. The truly wise person today isn't the one who shouts the loudest, but the one who listens best, not the one who answers the fastest, but the one who thinks more slowly. Intellectual patience isn't a luxury, it's an urgent necessity if we want to keep dialogue alive, coexistence possible, and mental health intact. Stoicism wasn't created to be an elite philosophy. It was designed as a daily practice, especially for hard situations. Epictetus, who was a slave before becoming a teacher, understood injustice and stupidity up close. That's why his philosophy isn't naive. It was forged through suffering. When he says, "We don't control others, only our reactions," he gives us a powerful key. Trying to control other people leads to frustration, but mastering yourself leads to inner freedom. And patience is exactly that mastery, applied in the moments that matter most. Stoic virtue isn't cold or detached. It's calm. It's the active steadiness of someone who knows the world's chaos doesn't have to poison the soul. And that only comes through practice, repetition, attention. In a world of artificial intelligence, deep fakes, algorithms that trap people in bubbles, and debates that grow more fractured every day, the human intelligence that will survive won't be the fastest. It'll be the deepest. And depth requires patience. In the future, one of the most valuable skills may be the ability to listen calmly, resist the urge to react immediately, and choose words carefully. A patient mind will be rare and therefore powerful. To cultivate patience as an intellectual virtue isn't to step backward. It's to move forward with wisdom. It's understanding that the path of reason is narrow, and it can only be walked by someone willing to move with deliberate slowness, without getting lost in the distractions of ego. When we see someone acting in a clearly wrong way, repeating prejudices, spreading misinformation, or behaving destructively simply because they lack awareness, our first impulse can be judgment. We label them, we reject them, and a lot of times we mock them. But as understandable as that reaction is, it reveals something important. We still haven't learned to see ignorance through the eyes of a wise person. In the Dhammapada, one of Buddhism's most important texts, the Buddha says, "Everyone trembles at violence, everyone fears death. Put yourself in the other person's place and do not kill or cause others to kill." That teaching goes beyond physical violence. It also speaks to moral and intellectual violence, the tendency to attack people who don't know, as if not knowing were an unforgivable sin rather than a normal stage of being human. In Buddhist thought, ignorance, avidya, is one of the three roots of suffering, alongside attachment and aversion. It isn't a moral failure, it's a mental condition. An ignorant mind isn't just wrong, it's trapped in cycles of illusion, ego, and fear. So the truly wise person doesn't respond with contempt, but with compassion, because they recognize that the other person is suffering, even when they look hostile. It's easy to fall into contempt. After all, it makes us feel superior when we notice someone else's mistake. But that reaction, even if it feels satisfying in the moment, only increases separation. It builds walls where there should be bridges. It feeds the ego and suffocates empathy. Compassion, on the other hand, takes real effort. It means stepping out of the role of judge and into the role of guide. It means resisting the urge to humiliate and instead offering something harder, the chance for clarity without shame. And it's worth remembering, all of us have been ignorant about something at some point, and we probably still are in many areas. So what's at stake here isn't superiority, but intellectual solidarity. It's not "I know and you don't," but "I've been there too, let me show you another way." There's a key distinction most people miss. Ignorance isn't the same as stupidity. An ignorant person may be intelligent, but lacking light, lacking information, reflection, or perspective. They're in the dark, stumbling through false ideas, inherited beliefs, or unexamined fears. Buddhist philosophy treats this condition with deep sensitivity. In Buddha's view, the ignorant person shouldn't be punished, but awakened. They don't need condemnation, they need clarity. And when that clarity is offered with kindness, it can actually transform someone. In the Sutta Nipata, the Buddha teaches, anger is never ended by more anger, but by love. This is an eternal truth. Applied to ignorance, the lesson is clear. You don't correct error with ridicule. You correct it with patience. You don't defeat someone's wrong thinking by shaming them, but by creating space for them to notice their mistake without feeling forced to defend themselves. During the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln was harshly criticized for treating his political opponents with respect, even when they attacked him fiercely. One of his advisors reportedly said, "Mr. President, you should destroy your enemies, not treat them like friends." Lincoln replied, "Don't I destroy my enemies when I make them my friends?" That kind of respect and understanding, even in conflict, shows a deeply wise principle. Ignorance is only disarmed when it doesn't feel threatened. By humanizing the opponent, Lincoln made room for dialogue instead of escalation. And this approach is extremely relevant today. In a time of polarization, where contempt has become the common language, compassion almost feels rebellious. But it's exactly where real hope for reconciliation lives. Today, ignorance spreads at digital speed. Fake news, conspiracy theories, hateful narratives, everything finds shelter inside misinformation bubbles. And our immediate reaction is often mockery. We laugh at the flat earther, we make fun of the denier, we dismiss the conspiracist. But does that actually solve the problem? Publicly humiliating someone may feel like a moral win, but usually the opposite happens. The ignorant person shuts down, feels attacked, and runs even deeper into the comfort of their bubble. The result? The mistake becomes stronger. Compassion doesn't mean agreeing or enabling. It means refusing to feed the cycle of emotional violence. It means finding more effective ways to talk, to teach, and to offer new perspectives, without destroying the person in the process. The real revolution against ignorance isn't repression, it's education. And real education isn't just transferring information. It's caring about the person you're trying to help shape. When the Buddha taught, he didn't humiliate people. He told stories. He asked questions. He reached the heart before trying to change the mind. That's the education of compassion. Transform without injuring. Free without attacking. What would the world look like if we treated the ignorant person not as an enemy of reason, but as someone who needs to be awakened with gentleness? Wisdom doesn't need to prove it's superior. It doesn't assert itself through force, but through consistency. And that's exactly why it doesn't look down on others, because it knows contempt is a kind of moral laziness. It's easier than educating, faster than listening, but the wise person has time. And more than that, they have patience with other people's pain, because they understand that behind every kind of ignorance, there's a story, there's fear, there's trauma, there's lack of opportunity, and that deserves compassion. The world we're building is increasingly flooded with data. But if we don't learn to deal with ignorance in a human way, all that data will only add more noise. Information alone doesn't transform people. The way it's offered determines whether it will set someone free or just deepen division. The future will demand more than logic. It will demand an ethics of listening, the ability to teach without attacking, to argue without dehumanizing. Only then can we fight ignorance without becoming cruel in the process. Not every discussion is real dialogue. Not every debate leads to understanding. And in many cases, insisting on convincing someone who isn't willing to listen is like yelling at the wind, exhausting, useless, and worse. It makes us start to look like the very thing we're trying to fight. Confucius, one of the greatest thinkers of the East, gave a direct and timeless warning in the Analects. Arguing with a fool is lowering yourself to his level, and down there, he wins with experience. That simple line carries sharp wisdom. It quietly asks, what's the real cost of arguing with someone who isn't searching for truth, but only trying to protect their own ignorance? There's a clear difference between someone who disagrees honestly and someone who just wants to win. The first person listens, reflects, and thinks things through. The second one reacts with contempt, twists your words, interrupts, mocks, and provokes. That's the fool's territory, the arena of provocation. And the most common mistake smart people make is taking the bait. Because the fool often isn't looking for clarity, he's looking for conflict. And when you accept the fight, even with solid arguments, you don't educate him. You just step into his game. Confucius understood this deeply. For him, a wise person's virtue is shown not only in what they say, but also in what they choose not to say. That choice is discernment. Knowing when to stay quiet isn't cowardice. It's quiet superiority. How many hours of our lives get wasted in arguments we already know won't go anywhere? Fights in group chats, comment wars on social media, family arguments that repeat in endless cycles. Sometimes the need to make someone understand turns into a subtle form of vanity. We don't just want to be right, we want to be seen as right. We want to win. And in that hunger for victory, we start to resemble the very person we're judging. That's the most dangerous trap, because it hides pride behind the mask of reason. Confucius invites us to flip the logic. Refusing a debate isn't weakness. It's refusing to waste yourself where nothing can grow. Even the best words won't take root in the barren soil of stubbornness. At first, clashing with a fool can look like courage, but often it's just an emotional reaction fueled by frustration. And that reaction, even if it feels justified, has a hidden cost. It changes you. Every time you answer in the same tone, strike back, or get fired up, you give up a piece of your own stability. The rational mind loses clarity, the heart hardens, and the ego inflates. In the end, the fool doesn't leave transformed, you leave drained. That's why Confucius insists. The wise person doesn't get pulled into empty arguments, not because they lack arguments, but because they respect their own mental integrity. During his trial, Socrates was falsely accused, mocked, and sentenced to death. He could have attacked his accusers, reacted with anger, and delivered fiery speeches. But he chose calm. He answered with irony and composure. He questioned, but didn't insult. He defended reason without losing his character. Socrates understood that the real battle wasn't against his accusers, it was against the corruption of the soul. And by staying faithful to his philosophy to the very end, he showed that there's no greater victory than preserving your own integrity, even in the face of injustice. That fits perfectly with Confucius's lesson. Don't fight the fool on the battlefield where he expects you. Stay where he can't reach you. In the digital age, arguing with fools has taken on a whole new scale. The internet created a stage where anyone can speak on anything, often with zero responsibility. In that world, follow accounts can look more important than the quality of someone's thinking. And the most dangerous part is this: many debates aren't about truth, they're about entertainment. The online fool doesn't want to learn. He wants likes. He wants to provoke. He wants to go viral. And when you enter that arena, even with great arguments, you become a character in a game that never ends. Avoiding pointless conflict in that context isn't staying silent out of fear. It's choosing a better path, creating deeper content, producing real knowledge, encouraging doubt, not mockery. That does more good than 1,000 useless arguments. There is a kind of silence that carries power, not the silence of indifference, but the silence of self-control. When you choose not to respond, not because you don't have the words, but because you understand the other person isn't ready to listen, that's strength. Confucius valued discernment, knowing who to speak to, when to speak, and how far to go. For him, wisdom wasn't just about what you say, but about timing. The one who knows when to speak and when to stay silent is closer to wisdom. That's the kind of silence that protects you. It saves your energy for higher causes. It keeps you focused on what truly matters. Teaching those who are thirsty, not pouring water onto soil that rejects it. Instead of arguing with the fool, Confucius points to a different way. Live as an example. Show through actions what words can't teach. Often, the quiet of someone who refuses to join petty fights speaks louder than 1,000 arguments. A calm presence, steady strength, and a refusal to play the provocation game. These things build moral authority. And over time, that authority speaks louder than any quick comeback. It's possible that with time, even the fool notices the difference and slowly starts to question his certainty. But that usually happens when he observes, not when he's attacked. And in the future, where will the wise person be? The world is likely to get louder and louder. Shallow opinions, polarization, symbolic battles, everything pushes us toward noise. That's exactly why the value of conscious silence will grow. People will start to realize it's not worth arguing with someone who refuses to hear. And in that new reality, the truly wise person will be the one who knows where to invest their intellectual energy, not in empty debates, but in creating spaces where reason can grow in depth. The virtue won't be in winning arguments, but in refusing to be infected by the logic of constant conflict. The new kind of leader won't be the one who claps back with anger, but the one who guides with calm. Not every mistake needs to be pointed out with direct confrontation. Not every correction has to come with humiliation. Socrates, one of the founders of Western philosophy, gave us one of the most refined and effective ways to deal with ignorance: the Socratic method, guiding ideas to be born. Along with it comes Socratic irony, which disarms without insulting, challenges without attacking, and reveals without forcing. In the Apology of Socrates, written by Plato, we witness one of the clearest examples of this philosophical posture. Accused of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the city's gods, Socrates doesn't defend himself with anger or self-pity. Instead, he answers with questions, exposes his accusers' contradictions, and breaks down their certainty, not with aggression, but with clarity. I know that I know nothing. That isn't a confession of weakness, it's the start of a method, recognizing your own limits as the starting point for real knowledge. Today, the word irony is often tied to sarcasm, hidden contempt, or mockery. But Socratic irony is very different. At its core, it's a strategy of humility and intelligence. Socrates would act as if he didn't know, not to manipulate, but to make the other person think. By placing himself as the learner, he created space for the other person to fully reveal their thinking. This kind of irony isn't offensive. It's educational. It works like a mirror. Socrates didn't say, "You're wrong." He asked, "Are you sure? What exactly do you mean by that word?" And little by little, the person would get trapped in their own contradictions. That's a powerful lesson for our time. You can expose stupidity with elegance, without humiliating, without yelling, simply by guiding someone to the moment where their certainty collapses and doubt enters as a seed of change. The word maiutics comes from the Greek maiutike, meaning the art of helping with childbirth. Socrates compared his role to that of a midwife, like his own mother, who was one. He didn't put ideas into people's heads. He helped them bring out what was already there, poorly formed, confused, or hidden. For Socrates, ignorance wasn't just not knowing. It was thinking, you know when you don't. And that's exactly where the method becomes powerful. With the right questions, at the right pace, the person begins to realize they don't actually understand what they thought they understood. It's a constructive collapse, a break that comes before real understanding. Unlike a typical debate, where one person tries to defeat the other, the Socratic method aims at the birth of a new awareness. The goal isn't to prove someone wrong, but to create the conditions for them to discover their own inconsistency. And when that discovery comes from within, it's far more transformative than any outside argument. In the Apology, there's a revealing moment. Socrates says that when he heard the oracle of Delphi had declared him the wisest man in Athens, he was surprised. So he began to investigate. He went to politicians, poets, and craftsmen, people full of certainty. He asked questions, and he realized they all seemed to know a lot, until they were challenged. A poet, for example, spoke beautifully, but couldn't explain what beauty actually was. A politician spoke about justice, but couldn't define what just really meant. Socrates didn't ridicule them, he simply questioned them, and their answers collapsed on their own. That story shows something important. Truth rarely lives in the first answers. It appears in the friction between what we think we know and what we can actually justify. In today's world, where polarization has become the norm, the Socratic approach is more necessary than ever. We live in an era of loud opinions and fragile certainty. People shout beliefs with little foundation, and the most common response has been direct confrontation. Debunk, correct, accuse. But that rarely works. What works? Asking questions, not to embarrass, but to awaken. Why do you believe that? Where did you see that? How do you tell the difference between an opinion and a fact? Questions like these don't attack, they shine light. And too much light can feel uncomfortable for someone living off unexamined certainty. But that discomfort is often what comes before growth. Today, the Socratic method can be more useful than aggressive rhetoric. It requires listening, patience, and trust in the power of reason. Exactly what's missing from many modern debates. When someone is holding tightly to a false belief, confronting them head-on often creates resistance. The ego feels attacked, the defense system turns on, and the person shuts down. But when the approach is indirect, when a question enters like a seed instead of a punch, something different happens. Reflection begins to grow. Socrates understood that people naturally resist being corrected. That's why he didn't try to win. He made people think, and thinking is something no one can do for you. It's an individual, sometimes lonely, but freeing journey. That's why using irony and the Socratic method is more than a technique. It's deep respect for the other person's autonomy. You don't force truth on anyone. You simply point to the inconsistency and let them choose, stay the same, or grow. Marshall Rosenberg, the creator of nonviolent communication, NVC, echoes the Socratic spirit by promoting language that doesn't attack or judge, but invites understanding. Even though his work isn't philosophy in the classical sense, it has a close relationship with the Socratic method. It starts with listening and questions, not with forcing conclusions. The strength of NVC is exactly that. It avoids the battlefield of pointless conflict. It teaches that instead of saying, "You're wrong," it's often more effective to ask, "Could you explain what you mean by that?" That approach disarms people, it lowers their defenses, and it opens a door to awareness. Together, these two tools form a kind of philosophical martial art. Socratic irony softens the ground. The Socratic method digs deep. One creates space for dialogue, the other guides discovery. Both require emotional control, intellectual refinement, and a true willingness to listen. And here's the beauty of it. When you use these tools, you don't just avoid unnecessary conflict, you plant seeds of reflection that can grow long after the conversation ends. Even if the person doesn't change immediately, they've been touched. And maybe, in silence, they'll start to think differently. In a hyper-connected world where everyone wants to be heard, the person who knows how to listen and ask smart questions will become more and more valuable. Empty debates, loud reason, ego battles, those things eventually burn out. Sooner or later, people start craving depth. And depth comes from doubt, humility, and listening. Those who adopt the Socratic approach won't just be wiser, they'll be more effective at helping others change. Because as Socrates understood, it's in the discomfort of recognized ignorance that the desire to learn is born. The real sign of wisdom isn't how much you know, it's how you share what you know. And one of the biggest temptations that comes with intelligence is arrogance, the quiet, or sometimes loud, belief that because you know more, you are more valuable, more worthy, more important. Laozi, the Taoist master and author of the Tao Te Ching, left an essential teaching about this. The wise are like water. It nourishes everything without competing. It stays in the low places others avoid. That's why it is close to the Tao. In that image is a powerful idea, humility as a quiet strength. Just as water supports life without making a show of it, a wise person supports others without showing off. And even more than that, they choose to go lower, not out of submission, but out of deep understanding of their own nature. We live in a time where information is everywhere, but wisdom is rare. Many people know a lot, but they use knowledge like a weapon, not a bridge. They point out someone else's mistake, not to help, but to perform. They correct with sarcasm. They mock with pleasure. They ridicule beginners just to feed their own ego. But that isn't wisdom. That's vanity. It's a kind of intellectual flexing that turns knowledge into a show. And as Laozi warns, the need to show off is a sign of imbalance. A truly wise person doesn't shine to blind others. They bring light gently. They don't impose. They suggest. They don't pressure. They invite. And above all, they never turn their greater knowledge into someone else's humiliation. Here's the bitter irony. When someone becomes arrogant because they know more, that knowledge has already started to rot. An arrogant mind is no longer serving truth. It's serving pride. And pride, as philosophy has always taught, is a veil that clouds your vision. Laozi saw arrogance as a sign of being disconnected from the Tao, the natural, harmonious flow of life. For him, the wise person is the one who empties themselves, who doesn't see themselves as superior, even when they are advanced, who doesn't compete, even when they're right, because they understand knowledge isn't meant to dominate, it's meant to nourish, like water. And once you truly understand that, something changes. Intelligence stops being a wall and becomes a garden, a space where the other person can grow, not feel smaller. Mahatma Gandhi, although he was a lawyer, a serious reader of philosophy and deeply knowledgeable about history, never spoke to humiliate anyone. On the contrary, it was common to see him kneeling to talk with farmers, sewing his own clothes, eating with his hands like the simplest people. For him, nobody was inferior for knowing less. In fact, real knowledge demanded that the educated person lower their tone, slow down their words, and meet people where they are. That attitude wasn't an act. It was lived philosophy. Exactly what Laozi pointed to. Lead without controlling, teach without crushing. In a time when many people use knowledge as a stage for ego, Gandhi reminds us that knowledge that doesn't build bridges and only builds pedestals loses its purpose. Interestingly, arrogance doesn't always come from too much confidence. Many times, it's a mask for fear. Fear of not being respected, fear of losing status, fear that someone, even knowing less, might still have something you don't. Sensitivity, intuition, or the courage to ask questions. Someone who is truly secure in their wisdom doesn't need to show it off. They understand knowledge isn't a trophy, it's a tool. And if you're truly serving what's right, you don't need everyone to notice how much you know. Laozi didn't see knowledge as power, but as responsibility. If you know more, you go lower, you speak more softly, you listen more deeply, because you understand the real teacher is the one who serves the other person's growth, not their own praise. Deep down, there's always tension between a mind that learns and an ego that feeds on learning. The more we know, the easier it is to forget where we started, to forget that one day we didn't know either, to forget the people who taught us with patience. That's why Eastern philosophy insists so much on the practice of emptying. A cup that's already full can't receive more water, and if a wise person wants to keep growing, they have to keep emptying themselves of vanity, rigid certainty, and the need for approval. Laozi knew that. That's why he wrote, "The one who shows off doesn't shine. The one who brags doesn't stand out. True power is quiet." And that quietness becomes greatness. Today, with social media and platforms built for attention, knowledge has also become a currency of ego. Intellectual showboating shows up in harsh comments, humiliating public corrections, and sarcasm disguised as logic. It's common to see people correcting others with almost cruel pleasure, calling them stupid, ignorant, sheep, brainwashed, as if contempt were a way to enlighten, as if mocking were teaching. But as Laozi would say, anyone who steps on others to climb higher forgets they're dirtying their own path. We have to remember, correcting someone isn't winning. It's caring. And you can only care with empathy, humility, and a real desire to help. Otherwise, it's just ego performance. If you truly want to teach, you have to learn the other person's pace. You have to recognize where they are and speak from there. Patience matters. Your language has to be simple and clear. And above all, your tone has to be kind. Because learning isn't only rational, it's emotional. A humiliated person doesn't learn. They shut down. They resist. And even if we're right, if our approach hurts, the knowledge gets lost. Real education, whether in a classroom, a casual conversation, or a video online, happens when the other person feels respected, when they feel they're not being judged, but supported. And in the future, humility will become the new sign of authority. As artificial intelligence grows, access to information will become more and more universal. But what will remain rare is the human ability to teach with empathy, to share with kindness, to guide without showing off. The wise person of the future won't be the one who knows the most, but the one who knows how to care for knowledge, who offers it like food, not like crumbs thrown down from a tower. Laozi already saw that coming. The true leaders will be the ones who don't compete, don't force, and don't perform. Their wisdom will be felt, not just heard. In a time of polarization and non-stop noise, truly understanding what someone else is saying has become one of the hardest things to do, and also one of the most valuable. Interpreting people with generosity, even when we disagree or think they're wrong, requires a rare kind of strength, the willingness to listen in good faith. Hans-Georg Gadamer, in his major work Truth and Method, offers a key idea for real dialogue and healthy coexistence, the principle of intellectual charity. This principle says that when we hear or read an opinion, we should assume the other person has something reasonable to say, even if, at first glance, it sounds foolish, confusing, or mistaken. Before we argue back, we should look for the best possible meaning in what they're saying. That attitude doesn't just keep conversation alive, it raises the level of thinking for everyone involved. We often connect the word charity to emotional compassion, like it means pity, but here it means something different: interpretive generosity. In other words, instead of hunting for flaws, contradictions, or absurd lines we can attack, which is very tempting, we do the opposite. We look for what is most plausible, most coherent, and most sensible in the other person's message. That takes mental discipline, because our natural impulse, especially when we disagree, is to assume the other person is uninformed, inconsistent, or simply wrong. But intellectual charity invites a different path. Interpret their words as if they're trying to get it right, even if they express themselves poorly. Gadamer believed real philosophical dialogue starts with the idea that no statement comes out of nowhere. Every view carries a history, a horizon of meaning, a context. And because of that, it deserves to be interpreted with respect. How many times have we dismissed someone's opinion without truly trying to understand it? How many times have we labeled someone ignorant, brainwashed, or stupid when we never went deeper than the surface of their words? The speed of our judgment shows not only impatience, but a kind of intellectual arrogance. Intellectual charity doesn't mean we must agree with everything. It means we should understand what the other person meant in the strongest, fairest way before we reject their idea. That kind of posture requires humility and active listening, the kind that doesn't just wait for its turn to speak, but actually opens up to the possibility that there might be something worth thinking about carefully. Abraham Lincoln, known for sharp political intelligence and strong rhetoric, was also a master of intellectual charity in practice. Instead of violently attacking his opponents, even in a situation as extreme as the American Civil War, Lincoln tried to understand what might be legitimate in the other side's perspective, even if it was limited. In his second inaugural address, he said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in." Those words aren't just poetic, they're strategic. By showing interpretive charity even toward people who were wrong, Lincoln didn't just raise the tone of the debate, he built real bridges toward reconciliation. What Lincoln understood, and what Gadamer later developed philosophically, is that seeing the other person in their best light can lower conflict without eliminating criticism. You can disagree with someone deeply and still do it with respect, but that takes cognitive empathy, an intellectual gesture that says, I'm going to understand your idea the way you'd want it represented before I explain why I think it's wrong. Only in that space does real dialogue happen. Otherwise, it's not dialogue. It's just a war of arguments. Intellectual charity turns disagreement into something constructive. The goal isn't to win. It's to clarify ideas, refine thinking, and reach a higher understanding of what's really at stake. Unfortunately, modern culture often moves in the opposite direction. Social media, algorithms, and the logic of likes reward sarcasm, mockery, and quick dismissal. Misunderstanding someone on purpose has become a tactic. Twisting what someone said just to attack it more easily has become a method. It's easy to find debates where people respond not to what was actually said, but to a weaker version of it. The straw man, and worse, that kind of bad faith interpretation gets applauded because it generates cheap applause, catchy lines, and viral moments. But as Gadamer pointed out, truth isn't found in shouting, it's found in listening. And listening with charity is the antidote to the collapse of public debate. Gadamer was a major thinker in philosophical hermeneutics, the study of interpretation. For him, understanding isn't just decoding words, it's a fusion of horizons, your perspective meeting the other person's. That fusion requires openness, recognizing that our view is also limited and the other person might expand it, even if they think differently. That's why intellectual charity is so powerful. It creates a space where ideas can meet instead of attack each other. Gadamer wrote, "Being open to the other means recognizing that they might be right, or that there is something in their view I haven't understood yet." That kind of openness isn't relativism, it's intellectual maturity. Practicing intellectual charity is more than a philosophical virtue. It's a strategy for civilized living. In a world with many cultures, opinions, beliefs, and ways of life, generous interpretation is what makes living together possible without violence. It's not about accepting everything. It's about understanding before criticizing. It's interpreting people not with malice or suspicion, but with a sincere effort to find the best meaning in what they're saying. That doesn't stop us from disagreeing. It just stops us from being unfair. And fairness, in this context, means representing the other person's idea accurately, even when you completely disagree with it. In a hyper-connected world where everyone has a voice, the intelligence that will stand out won't be only logical or technical. It will be relational and ethical. Listening deeply, interpreting fairly, responding calmly, these will be the most valuable traits in the thinkers, educators, communicators, and leaders of the future. Intellectual charity will become more and more the mark of the wise, because it turns noise into meaning, conflict into cooperation, difference into learning. We live in an era where reason is treated almost like a god. Logic, strong arguments, and skill with abstract ideas are often seen as the highest form of intelligence. But the philosopher Immanuel Kant gives us a serious warning, one that few people are willing to face. No matter how brilliant it is, reason has limits, and ignoring those limits is a disguised form of stupidity. In his major work, Critique of Pure Reason, Kant begins with a question that still matters today. What can I know? And the answer, even though it's complex, can be summed up like this. The human mind can't understand everything. There are boundaries we can't cross. There are questions that go beyond what rational thinking can reach. And when we insist on judging the world and other people only through that lens, we fall into a dangerous illusion. The first big mistake is believing reason is an absolute tool, that anything true must be fully explainable by logic. But the history of science and philosophy shows otherwise. Many truths don't fit into formal proofs, cold deduction, or rigid systems. Kant explains that human reason works through internal structures, categories, forms of perception, time and space that shape how we understand the world. In other words, we don't see things as they are. but as we're able to perceive them. That should make us humble, because it means reason isn't a window into the absolute, it's a lens, and lenses have limits. Ignoring that is like confusing a map with the territory. Rational intelligence is a powerful tool, yes, but it is not reality itself. A lot of times, we judge others using purely rational standards: how clearly they argue, how fast they think, how well they handle concepts, and we ignore other essential parts of wisdom: sensitivity, intuition, lived experience, and emotional depth. Human beings are not just minds, and truth isn't limited to what can be proven. Art, spirituality, love, pain, these things carry truths that don't fit into formulas. Anyone who tries to explain a mother's suffering using only logic misses the point. Anyone who tries to describe the beauty of a sunset with equations does too. Kant would say that this desire for reason to take over everything is a subtle kind of dogmatism. The same dogmatism he challenged by showing that reason must know its own limits. It needs to know how far it can go and where it starts creating illusions. During the 1800s and much of the 1900s, reason was celebrated as a symbol of progress. But ironically, many horrors were justified in the name of reason. Racist theories, eugenics, policies of social exclusion, all of them used scientific language, formal logic, and so-called intelligence to defend the indefensible. It was rationality without ethics, logic without conscience, and the result: concentration camps, legalized slavery, pseudo-scientific experiments that violated human dignity. That history matters because it reminds us that reason, when separated from humility and compassion, can become monstrous. There's a subtle kind of arrogance that shows up in people who see themselves as intellectually superior. They know arguments, quote authors, tear down ideas quickly, but they don't know how to listen. They don't know how to care. And they often look down on anyone who thinks differently. But Kant shows that this behavior is paradoxically a sign of ignorance, because it reveals a failure to recognize the limits of one's own rational framework. The person becomes trapped inside their own system, unable to see beyond it. And here's the deeper lesson: recognizing the limits of reason isn't intellectual failure. It's a higher kind of intelligence. It's when reason turns inward, becomes self-critical, and realizes that no matter how much it knows, there's a vast world it can't reach. In the second part of Kant's project, especially in Critique of Practical Reason, he shows that reason isn't only for understanding the world, but also for acting in the world. And in that practical sphere, we enter a different domain: morality. Theoretical reason may not be able to prove God, the soul, or free will. But practical reason, the kind that guides our actions, starts with an ethical demand. We should act as if our choices could become universal laws. In other words, it's more important than sounding brilliant in arguments to be fair in your actions. Real wisdom isn't about winning debates, it's about living in a way that matches ethical principles. So judging people only by their logical skill reduces the human being to an argument machine and forgets that some of the most ethical, sensitive, and truthful people may not be great at rhetoric. Experience and reason, two worlds that work together. Another key point in Kant's philosophy is that all knowledge begins with experience. Before we think, we feel. Before we analyze, we perceive. Reason by itself, without contact with lived experience, is empty, just as experience without reflection is blind. That balance between reason and sensitivity has to be cultivated. Pure rationalism can turn a person cold. Pure emotion can lose coherence. Wisdom is recognizing the limits of both and learning how to integrate them. In recent years, people have talked a lot about emotional intelligence, and for good reason. In a world flooded with information, it's not enough to know things. You have to know how to live with others, how to listen, how to talk, how to respect. Those skills don't come only from logic. They come from empathy, self-control, and awareness of others. And that kind of intelligence is often missing in the very people who see themselves as more rational. Kant didn't use the phrase emotional intelligence, but his philosophy points in that direction. Knowledge should serve life, not the ego. We're also entering an era of artificial intelligence, where algorithms make decisions based on data, patterns, and pure logic. That raises a new question. What is human intelligence really? Maybe the answer is exactly what reason can't fully capture. The ability to make mistakes, to doubt, to forgive, to imagine, to love. The ability to say, I don't know, and still keep searching. Recognizing the limits of reason isn't an invitation to irrational thinking. It's a call to wisdom, a wisdom that knows where logic ends and where the mysteries begin, the ones only silence can truly hold. We live in a time where labels stick fast. Stupid, ignorant, dumb, sheep, brainwashed. People throw these words like arrows at anyone who thinks differently, makes a mistake, or repeats false information. But this reaction, as common and impulsive as it is, shows more impatience than wisdom. John Stuart Mill, in On Liberty, offers an idea that sounds almost radical today: the right to initial ignorance, the right to not know something without being instantly condemned for it. For Mill, public debate isn't a ring where winners and losers fight. It's a space where knowledge should be grown with freedom and respect. And that requires something basic but deeply important: knowing the difference between stupidity and lack of knowledge. They are not the same, and confusing them is, ironically, a subtle kind of stupidity. Lack of knowledge is a condition, a temporary state. It means not having access to the right information, not having training, not having good sources. Stupidity is something deeper. It's a deliberate refusal to think. It's a conscious disrespect for learning. It's stubborn pride that chooses to stay in the dark. When we call someone stupid just because they're misinformed, we judge them based on a snapshot, not a journey. We forget most people aren't born knowing things, and that much of what we know today was once unknown to us too. Mill wrote, "The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs. And that freedom includes the right to form an opinion, even a wrong one, and to be corrected through dialogue, not humiliation." How often do we see well-educated, rational people treat others with contempt simply because they don't have the same background? They turn knowledge into a shield, correction into humiliation, argument into attack. But the truly wise person, as Mill reminds us, doesn't fear disagreement. They welcome it, because they know the clash of ideas is exactly what makes truth come out stronger. For Mill, free speech isn't only an individual right, it's a collective tool for clarity. And it only works when everyone has a voice, including and especially people who are misinformed, because by listening to someone, even when they're wrong, we test our own arguments, widen our perspective, and discover where there's still work to be done. Mill believed deeply in the power of public debate. For him, truth doesn't need to be protected through censorship or silencing. It needs to be tested. It needs to be challenged, questioned, confronted by other ideas, even the most absurd ones. That's why kicking bad ideas out of the conversation weakens the public space. It turns discussion into a monologue, and at the same time, it closes the door to growth for the person who, because they lack information, is still feeling their way in the dark. If the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit: the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. That passage from On Liberty reminds us that even error can teach, if it's not mocked, but challenged with good arguments and good faith. Frederick Douglass, formerly enslaved, an abolitionist, and a major 19th century intellectual, used to say that slaveholders' biggest fear was slaves learning to read, because ignorance was the key to control. Keeping someone uninformed is a way of keeping them submissive. But Douglass also understood that nobody should be blamed for not having learned yet. The real crime is blocking access to knowledge, not being born without it. And his activism was built on that: teach, educate, clarify, never humiliate. That mindset fits perfectly with Mill's thinking. Both believed that debate, when done with respect, can turn even deep ignorance into critical awareness. Telling the difference between stupidity and lack of knowledge means believing people can change. It means treating the other person as someone in process, not someone permanently condemned. Mill argued that every opinion should be free as long as it doesn't directly harm others. But even opinions that are wrong, confused, or poorly expressed should be heard, so they can be challenged and refined through rational discussion. That requires an education of listening, a commitment to dialogue that transforms, where knowledge isn't a status symbol, but a bridge between worlds. Today, we often see people being cancelled, attacked, and labelled for awkward opinions, poorly worded statements, or misinformed positions, and that creates an environment where fear shuts down learning. Mill wouldn't defend no consequences for mistakes, but he would definitely question the cruelty of instant condemnation. He believed open debate is the best way to correct errors, not through force, but through rational persuasion. Treating someone who is wrong as hopeless is the opposite of Mill's philosophy. It turns error into destiny instead of a starting point for change. A modern application: how do you talk to someone who's misinformed? In a time of mass misinformation, the most common reaction is contempt. But that only strengthens bubbles, increases radicalization, and pushes away the very people who most need clarity. The more effective response, as Mill taught, is to keep the channel open, listen before judging, correct firmly, yes, but with respect. Treat ignorance as something that can be treated, not as a character defect. That's how debate becomes productive. That's how ideas grow, and that's how people change. Taking the time to explain something to someone who still doesn't understand takes inner strength, because it's easier to mock, cancel, or ignore. But real power is in the patience to build a bridge, one argument at a time. That's what Mill called the responsibility of freedom. Not using free speech as a weapon, but as a tool for clarity. Not crushing what's wrong, but shining light on it until the error becomes clear and can be overcome. In a world where everyone seems determined to be right, to speak the loudest, or to win the debate, there's a forgotten art. The art of saying something without turning it into a fight, teaching without forcing, reaching someone without attacking, shining a light on ignorance without triggering resistance. That's the path of the Taoist master Zhuangzi, one of the greatest sages of ancient China. Zhuangzi didn't write logical treatises. He didn't debate in public assemblies. He wasn't obsessed with refuting people. What did he do instead? He told stories. He used parables, poetic images, absurd metaphors, talking animals, and mysterious dreams. And through all of that, he delivered deep truths without ever raising his voice. Those who argue do not perceive the Tao. Truth is not won with sharp words, but felt like wind on the skin. That idea is more necessary today than ever, because when we face stupidity, especially the stubborn kind that arms itself against any direct correction, logical arguments often fail, but images, stories, and examples can slip through the cracks of a defensive mind and touch something deeper. How many times have you tried to explain something with perfect logic and still been ignored, mocked, or misunderstood? How many times have you presented facts, evidence, data, and the other person still wouldn't budge? That happens because the problem, most of the time, isn't a lack of information. It's inner rigidity. A mind that doesn't want to listen rejects the facts before it even understands them. And when it feels confronted, it shuts down even more. Zhuangzi understood this instinctively. He knew that trying to convince someone who is already defensive is like trying to water a rock, so he went around the resistance. Instead of attacking the mistake directly, he told a story that made the mistake reveal itself, like a mirror. And that's the key. Metaphors don't confront. They hint, they touch, they plant seeds. They don't force truth. They let it grow, if the soil is even a little fertile. One of the most famous passages in the Zhuangzi is the butterfly dream. Once I dreamed I was a butterfly, happily flying around, not knowing I was Zhuangzi. When I woke up, I didn't know if I was Zhuangzi who had dreamed of being a butterfly, or a butterfly now dreaming I was Zhuangzi. That simple, dreamlike image shakes our certainty about reality. There are no dogmatic claims, no logical conclusions, just a quiet question that invites doubt. What if what you call reality is only one point of view? Zhuangzi doesn't say, your idea is wrong. He offers a metaphor that softens rigidity. And that subtlety is exactly what allows reflection to rise from within, instead of being forced from the outside. Logic can persuade, but metaphor can move you. Logic speaks to the rational mind. Metaphor speaks to your deeper sense of meaning. And when you're dealing with stubborn foolishness, old prejudices, or deeply rooted beliefs, it's the heart that often needs to be reached. Think about Jesus in the Gospels. He rarely answers in a direct, blunt way. Most of the time, he speaks through parables. Why? Because stories allow each person to see themselves inside them. Truth told as a story disarms the ego. Truth delivered like a verdict, on the other hand, triggers defense. Zhuangzi does the same. He doesn't argue abstract concepts with technical terms. He tells you that a fish can't explain the ocean to a frog that lives in a well. And suddenly the reader wonders, am I the frog in the well? That's the power of metaphor. It makes the question appear inside the listener. And when doubt is born on its own, it's stronger than any argument. When we face stupidity, especially the kind that shows up as arrogance, aggression, or rigid certainty, our instinct is to push back, to prove we're right, to argue, to point out the mistake. But experience shows that almost never works. Zhuangzi suggests another posture. Don't sink to the same level. Don't argue on the battlefield of rigidity. Instead, speak with subtlety, with symbols, even with humor. Because when the mind won't listen, the imagination can still be reached. This doesn't mean being vague or excusing error. It means choosing a deeper strategy. Metaphor isn't cowardice, it's wisdom. It's the art of teaching without hurting, correcting without exposing, leading someone into reflection without crushing them. Today, a lot of communicators use humor to say what would be rejected if it were said directly. Comedians, cartoonists, filmmakers, they all use symbolic power to spark reflection. A classic example is Charlie Chaplin's film, The Great Dictator. In the middle of World War II, Chaplin uses tenderness and absurdity to satirize Hitler, and by doing that, he exposes the madness of totalitarianism more effectively than an academic speech ever could. Zhuangzi would have applauded because he would recognize that Chaplin was doing philosophy through another medium, using images, situations, and exaggeration to reach the collective unconscious, where pure logic can't go. And that's exactly the approach we need to recover today, especially when dealing with absurd ideas. Use images that speak to the human before speaking to the rational. Fables, stories, myths. These ways of speaking carry ancient wisdom. They don't simply tell you what's right. They show you a situation where the mistake becomes obvious. And by doing that, they avoid direct collision. Zhuangzi reminds us that stupidity often feeds on confrontation. A fool, when attacked, becomes even more stubborn. But when invited to think through an image, they might lower their guard and maybe see what used to feel invisible. That's why teaching through metaphors is also an act of respect. It treats the other person as someone capable of interpreting, discovering on their own, and growing without being pushed. In an age of heated debates where every side tries to destroy the other, we need to bring back Zhuangzi's wisdom. Speak with images, not hammers. Teach with softness. Tell stories. Build bridges through symbols. The intelligence of the future will be symbolic, because it will matter more to move people than to prove things. People will be exhausted by arguments, but still hungry for meaning. And meaning can't be forced. It has to be revealed. Zhuangzi understood that long before us. That's why he still feels current, even after 2,000 years. Not every fight is noble. Not every argument is worth having. And definitely not every battle deserves your energy. Life is about choices. and choosing where to invest your time, attention, and effort is an art that separates the wise from the impulsive, the mature from the anxious, the thoughtful from the reactive. Arthur Schopenhauer, a 19th century German philosopher, wasn't known for being gentle. He was known for his blunt realism. In Aphorisms on the Wisdom of Life, he gives a direct and powerful lesson. Don't waste energy trying to convince people who don't want to learn. Arguing with fools or fanatics is like throwing pearls to pigs. The pearl doesn't lose its value, but it's wasted. That line sums up a life attitude that's pure gold, especially today, when endless stimulation, constant debate, and constant invitations to conflict can burn up our attention like an uncontrolled fire. Schopenhauer is basically telling us, save your flame for places where it can actually light something up. First, you have to understand that for Schopenhauer, the most precious thing we have isn't money, status, or even knowledge. It's time. Time is the raw material of life, and wasting it means wasting your life. Every pointless argument, every attempt to convince someone locked into unshakable certainty, every explanation given to someone who refuses to listen, none of that time comes back. It's energy thrown into a bottomless well. Schopenhauer calls this kind of effort wasting the will. And in his philosophy, the will sits at the center of human life. Spending it on meaningless conflict is a quiet form of self-harm. Protect yourself. Learn to step back. Inner peace costs too much to trade it for stupid victories. That wisdom, written almost 2 centuries ago, feels extremely current. A lot of people fool themselves into thinking winning an argument is a trophy, that proving someone wrong is a form of self-validation. But most of the time, that victory is empty. The other person doesn't learn. You get drained. And what's left is fatigue and ego. Schopenhauer warns that the urge to convince others is often rooted in pride disguised as love of truth. And because of that, we lose time in disputes that add nothing, neither to us nor to the other person. He recommends using a stricter filter. Before you step into a difficult conversation, ask yourself, does this person actually want to learn? Are they open? Are they looking for meaning? Or just trying to win? If the answer is no, the best move is simple. Stay silent, step away, or shift your focus. Today, social media is the favorite battlefield for useless debates. Everyone wants to be heard. Few people want to listen. The goal isn't truth, it's validation. And in that environment, trying to teach or explain something to someone who's in attack mode is a waste of precious time. You bring data, arguments, facts, and what you get back is sarcasm, memes, twisted interpretations. Frustration is guaranteed. And Schopenhauer would say, that's on you for walking onto a field where the game was already rigged. Saving your energy in those situations isn't cowardice. It's wise self-management. It's understanding that every minute you spend on someone who refuses to grow is a minute you don't spend with people who could grow with you. There are moments when the truth is obvious, clear, basic, and yet it's rejected with anger. In those cases, insisting is like arguing with the wind. Schopenhauer saw this as a problem of the will. People, driven by deep impulses, reject whatever threatens their illusions. And no amount of logic can break through that emotional armor. In situations like that, the wise person doesn't force their way in. They step back, not out of contempt, but out of economy. They know there are other fields to cultivate, other minds to reach, other projects that need their full energy. And that becomes an ethical choice. Using your life intelligently. Not living like you're constantly at war, but living as if your life is a work you're building with purpose. This lesson requires something essential: discernment, knowing who is worth your time to explain things to, teach, and invest in. Schopenhauer believed that a true teacher can't be available to everyone, not out of elitism, but out of self-protection. He saw wisdom like a fragile flame. If it's exposed to the constant wind of aggressive stupidity, it goes out. That's why he recommended being selective, not speaking less, but speaking better, to people who listen, to people who think, to people who, even when they disagree, are still searching for meaning. And more than that, discernment protects the wise person from becoming reactive, because constant reactivity turns even the sharpest mind into a reflection of the fights it keeps trying to win. And in that situation, stupidity wins without even needing to argue. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher, wrote something very close to Schopenhauer's lesson in his personal meditations. You don't have to have an opinion about everything. Save your soul for what matters. Even with absolute power, Marcus Aurelius understood his energy was limited, and wasting it on pointless arguments would betray his own philosophy. He preferred serenity over forced reason, strategic silence over useless conflict. Like Schopenhauer, Marcus Aurelius knew that living wisely means choosing where not to be. The power of saving energy. Where is it really worth fighting? Schopenhauer wasn't telling people to run away from the world. He was talking about emotional economy. He wanted us to use our energy to create, to love, to understand, to develop ideas, to build real friendships, to study, to enjoy the beauty of life. Those are the battles worth fighting. And in those battles, yes, we should show up fully, because there are people who want to learn. There are minds that open with respect. There are conversations that expand your soul. And there are causes that require courage and clear thinking. But to be fully present in those moments, we have to protect our strength. And strength is lost drop by drop in every unnecessary conflict. The best lesson doesn't always come from a teacher. Sometimes it comes from watching a fool repeat the same mistake, from a disastrous decision, from an empty statement said with total confidence, from an attitude that, if you pay attention, shows you exactly what not to do. Balthasar Gracian, a 17th century thinker and Jesuit, understood this clearly. In The Art of Worldly Wisdom, he says, "A wise person learns a lot by watching other people's mistakes, especially fools, and they don't always need to correct them. Some lessons are taught only by silence." That's a rare lesson, maybe even counterintuitive. We live in a time when many people feel morally or intellectually obligated to correct others all the time. But Gracian shows that sometimes wisdom isn't about pointing things out, but about observing, not reacting, but reflecting, not correcting, but learning, in silence. Gracian didn't see the fool as someone who is only worthy of contempt. Quite the opposite. To him, the fool is like an upside-down mirror of prudence, a negative example that teaches not through advice, but through stumbling, through impulsive choices, loud vanity, and the inability to recognize their own ridiculous behavior. It's as if life, in its quiet way of teaching, puts people in front of us who reveal, with brutal clarity, where wisdom is not, and it's up to the attentive observer to extract something valuable from that. But here's the key point. This can, and often should, be done without making a scene. Correcting a fool in public can trigger hostility without producing real change. They'll feel attacked, embarrassed, and respond with aggression or contempt. The result? A pointless drain. Public correction hurts pride more than it enlightens the mind, Gracian writes. So the wise person holds back, not out of indifference, but out of strategy. They observe, they take the lesson, and they move on. There are situations where trying to correct someone isn't just useless, it's risky. A fool, full of self-confidence, may react with anger. They may try to drag the person correcting them down. They may twist facts just to protect their image. And what could have been a moment of clarity turns into a conflict. Correcting someone who isn't ready to learn is like throwing a seed onto dry ground. Nothing grows. It's just wasted. Gracian suggests that in many cases, the best way to educate is not to interfere. Let the consequences speak for themselves. Let time, silent and ruthless, show what pride refuses to see. So the wise person learns indirectly, not through direct exchange, but through careful observation. And that kind of learning is often more effective, because it doesn't depend on the other person's ego. but on your own quiet intelligence. The Roman historian Tacitus, when writing about the emperors of his time, didn't always attack them head-on. He preferred to describe events coldly and clearly, letting the absurdity reveal itself. He didn't need to judge. The actions spoke for themselves. That style, something Gracian would admire, shows an important truth. Sometimes the silence that observes teaches more than 1,000 corrections, because it allows reality itself to shout what the wise person chooses not to say. Being able to see without reacting impulsively is a gift. More than that, it's a form of self-education, because someone else's mistake could be your tomorrow, if you don't learn to observe with humility and attention. It also helps to look inward at why we feel the need to correct others. Many times that impulse comes from a wounded ego, not from compassion. We want to look sharper, more aware, more intelligent. We want to prove we know better. And in doing that, we lose prudence. Teaching turns into self-promotion, and wisdom turns into vanity wearing a mask. Gracian invites us to a different path. Keep to yourself what could be said but doesn't need to be said. Because wisdom isn't measured by how much you speak, but by what you choose not to say, while still understanding everything clearly. Watching others' mistakes in silence isn't passive. It's strategically active. It creates inner space to process, compare, and reflect. The prudent person knows that every foolish act they see is a warning not to repeat it, Gracian says. When that observation is done well, it becomes prevention. Someone else's mistake, internalized as a lesson, can stop you from making the same mistake later. And that's more valuable than any correction you force on someone. Imagine the emotional freedom that creates. The peace of knowing you don't have to compete with anyone over wisdom. You can see, understand, grow, and move forward without proving anything. In the workplace, for example, you often watch people repeat the same mistakes, rash decisions, ego-driven choices, careless words. Correcting every single one can turn you into the annoying person, even if your intentions are good. Often the wiser move is to watch with clarity. Learn from what's happening. Apply that lesson to your own decisions. Be the quiet example, not the full-time corrector. The same goes for social media, where correcting people has almost become a sport. But as we've seen in other lessons, public correction without sensitivity usually creates resistance, not change. Gracian's wisdom reminds us, observe more, react less, and grow from it. Not every lesson comes from doing things right. In fact, some of our biggest leaps in awareness come from pain, ours or someone else's. When you watch a fool trip over the same obstacle for the third time and you finally realize that path doesn't work, you gain something valuable without having to crash yourself. That's the point. Learning from fools' mistakes is a shortcut, an elegant detour toward growth without the same consequences they had to pay. But to do that, you have to let go of the need to correct, to interfere, to save someone who may not even want to be saved, and focus on your own development, not out of selfishness, but out of practical wisdom. There's a kind of power stronger than shouting, more transformative than forcing your point, more convincing than any speech, the quiet example of a life guided by reason. Baruch Spinoza, one of the greatest philosophers of the 1600s, wrote in his masterpiece Ethics that living rationally is the path to real freedom. And for him, rationality isn't coldness or rigidity, it's clarity. It's living in a coherent, calm way, in harmony with how things really are. And above all, it means not trying to force people to change. A free person is one who lives under the guidance of reason. Spinoza believed a wise person doesn't waste time trying to convert the irrational. He understood that everyone is at a different level of awareness, shaped by passions, fears, and confusion. Forcing reason on someone who isn't ready is as pointless as trying to teach astronomy to someone who hasn't even learned to look at the sky. So he chooses a different path. Be the example. Live what you believe, with firmness, but without forcing it, with clarity, but without aggression, with conviction, but without needing to convince anyone. For Spinoza, reason isn't just the ability to argue. It's a way of living, a way of relating to the world, to yourself, and to other people. A rational person understands the causes behind events, including human emotions, and doesn't get dragged around by uncontrolled impulses. That inner control isn't repression, it's freedom. Freedom born from understanding. When we understand why we feel what we feel, think what we think, do what we do, we stop being slaves to our passions and start living with real autonomy. And most importantly, that freedom doesn't need to be loud. You can see it in someone's presence, in calm during chaos, in steadiness when others are wrong, in the absence of vanity when they win. And that quiet presence changes people more than any preaching ever could. We live in an era of heated opinions, militant speeches, and desperate attempts to change someone's mind. But those attempts often fail, because the other person isn't listening with openness, they're defending themselves. When reason is used like a weapon, it turns into a tool of domination. And Spinoza rejected every form of domination, even the subtle kind, because it creates resistance, not transformation. Nothing is more effective in educating people than the example of reason in practice. When you live rationally, without showing off, without pushing, you become a living reference point. And over time, that creates something force never can, a genuine desire to learn. When someone watches your steadiness, they start questioning their own way of living. And that's where change begins, from the inside out. Nelson Mandela, after 27 years in prison, walked out without a thirst for revenge. People expected rage. He offered dialogue. They expected payback. He offered reconciliation. That choice wasn't weakness. It was deep rationality. Mandela understood that retaliation would only feed the cycle of hate. He acted with clarity, with long-term vision, with self-control. And by doing that, he changed a country without trying to convert his enemies by force. It was his rational posture, lived with integrity, that convinced even the most skeptical. Spinoza would call that wisdom in action, quiet rationality, but powerful. A lot of people confuse living rationally with being cold, indifferent, or calculating. But for Spinoza, that's a misunderstanding. Reason doesn't deny feelings. It understands them. And by understanding them, it guides them. A rational person doesn't ignore other people's pain. They just know you don't heal shouting with more shouting. You don't dissolve ignorance through aggression. You do the opposite. You show through your own life that there's another way to exist. That's why a quiet example of rationality carries compassion, not blind compassion that accepts everything, but a clear-eyed compassion that chooses patience. Today, a lot of people exhaust themselves trying to explain the obvious to people who refuse to listen. Endless posts trying to prove a point, tear down arguments, call out absurdities. And often the result is just emotional burnout and more polarization. Spinoza would give different advice. Use fewer words, live more coherence. Be rational in how you live, not only in what you say. Show it through your habits, your tone, your steady inner life, everything you want to teach. In that sense, rationality can be contagious, not through pressure, but through resonance. When someone sees a person who is clear-minded, centered and calm, they start questioning themselves. And that quiet questioning is more fertile than any argument forced on them. Spinoza believed that emotions and desires move us more than concepts do, and that reason only becomes strong when it turns into a positive emotional force. When living rationally creates admiration, curiosity, and respect in others. It's not speeches that change people. It's the alignment between what you say and who you are. And that alignment doesn't need to be announced. People notice it. A truly rational person doesn't need to say they're rational. They act with clarity, with calm, with firmness, without cruelty. And that's enough. Throughout ethics, Spinoza offers a picture of the wise person that's deeply inspiring. Someone who understands how life works, who doesn't get drunk on success, or fall apart in failure, who seeks a lasting kind of joy that comes from understanding, not applause. This person doesn't need to prove anything, because their rationality isn't a performance. It's a foundation. It isn't a mask. It's who they are, and because of that, they influence others. Without pressure, without force, without noise. Wisdom that forces itself on others loses its light. Wisdom lived quietly shines outward. Finally, Spinoza says that reason leads to freedom, not external freedom, which depends on laws, governments, or circumstances, but inner freedom, the freedom that appears when we stop being slaves to passion, impulse, ego, and the need to convince, to win, to dominate. That freedom is silent, but deep, like a rock in the middle of a storm. It doesn't scream, but it holds. And when someone lives that way, they become like a lighthouse. Nobody argues with a lighthouse. It simply stands there, showing the way, for anyone who wants to see. We usually think of stupidity as something individual, someone lacking reflection, knowledge, or basic common sense. But there's a kind of stupidity that's even more dangerous, more subtle, and harder to notice: collective stupidity. Gustave Le Bon, in his classic book The Crowd, a study of the popular mind, published in the late 1800s, warned about this. He showed that even intelligent people, once they're inside a group, often lose critical thinking, rational judgment, and personal responsibility. And in that state, humanity's worst mistakes are born. A crowd is always intellectually inferior to the isolated individual. Le Bon didn't say this to insult ordinary people. He was making a careful observation. When we merge into a group, our mind changes. Our sense of identity weakens. Emotions get stronger. Reason steps back, and stupidity can appear, not from one foolish person, but from an irrational collective. The most striking part of crowd psychology is this: it's not only fools who act irrationally in groups, smart people do too. Educated, experienced, clear-headed individuals can get pulled into collective excitement and start repeating absurd ideas, adopting violent behavior, and justifying what should never be justified. That's one of Le Bon's biggest lessons. Individual intelligence does not guarantee collective clarity. Group pressure, the need to belong, and fear of disagreeing can silence reason, even in people who are usually rational. And the result is amplified stupidity, a kind of emotional contagion that turns a group of thinking individuals into one impulsive, easily manipulated body. Le Bon describes crowds as being driven by images, emotions, and impulses. A crowd doesn't think, it reacts. It doesn't weigh things, it follows. And most of all, it doesn't listen to opposing views. Its thinking becomes binary, simplified, and often childish. The most common emotions that take over crowds are fear, hate, blind admiration, and the desire to punish. That's why charismatic leaders, simple slogans, and clearly defined enemies have so much power in these situations. The crowd wants to feel, not understand. That's why Le Bon warns, decisions made in the heat of a crowd are rarely wise. A crowd demands immediate action, instant justice, easy solutions. But real life requires complexity, patience, and reflection. 3 things an inflamed collective usually rejects. During the French Revolution, crowds demanded justice, equality, and freedom. But before long, those same crowds began demanding blood, heads, punishment. The Enlightenment reason that inspired the movement gave way to a destructive collective irrationality. The most famous example is the period known as the Reign of Terror, when thousands of people were guillotined, often based on rumors or weak accusations. A crowd that once felt revolutionary became blind and even consumed its own leaders. That's the danger of collective stupidity. It doesn't recognize limits. Once it starts moving, it devours everything, including the people who helped feed it. Today, crowds don't gather only in the streets. They form on social media, mass comment attacks, cancel campaigns, online mobbing, viral misinformation. These are modern expressions of collective stupidity. And the most frightening part is the speed. In just minutes, a crowd can form around a post, a sentence, an image, and immediately start shouting, accusing, and condemning, often without understanding the context. If Le Bon were alive today, he would say, the behavior is the same. Only the stage has changed, emotion still rules, reason still gets silenced, and the individual, inside a digital crowd, still feels anonymous, protected, and fueled by easy validation. That's why a wise person today needs to understand that the danger isn't only individual stupidity, but the corrosive force of collective irrationality. And being careful around it is a sign of clarity. A truly wise person, when they see an irrational crowd forming, doesn't fight it head-on, because they know the crowd doesn't listen. It demands applause or silence. Any attempt to add nuance will be treated like betrayal, so the smartest move is often to step back, observe, wait for things to cool down, choose a different moment, a different place, a different way to intervene. Le Bon suggests distance, not out of contempt, but out of strategy. He understood that trying to reason with an excited crowd is like trying to talk to the ocean during a storm. That caution isn't cowardice, it's protected intelligence. One of Le Bon's central ideas is that emotions spread through a crowd like a virus. A shout of outrage multiplies, a violent gesture gets copied, fear grows, and soon the group acts like one body, without filters, without self-awareness. And here's the real danger. You can get infected without noticing. You can join a group with good intentions, and little by little start repeating behaviors you once thought were absurd. In moments like that, rationality requires vigilance. You have to notice when you're thinking and when you're just reacting to the group. That difference is essential if you want to keep your inner freedom. Le Bon points out that the most effective ideas in crowds appeal to instinct, not logic. Short phrases, catchwords, slogans, those work. Complex concepts, nuance, well-built arguments, those don't. That's why educating a crowd is almost impossible. The wiser move is to reach the individual, away from the chorus. Reflection happens in silence, in solitude, in the space where the voice of reason can finally be heard. So how should you respond to collective stupidity? Recognize the pattern. Understand that yes, even intelligent people can be pulled in. Humility matters here. Avoid direct confrontation. The crowd won't listen. Arguing with it only drains you and turns you into a target. Protect your personal reason. Stay clear-minded even when everyone else seems to lose it. That takes courage and self-control. Plant seeds outside the crowd. Talk to individuals. Build small spaces for reflection. Create environments where thinking can breathe. Those are the actions that actually change things. Not in a flashy way, but in a deep and lasting way. Wisdom doesn't always show up in what we say. Sometimes it shows up in what we hold back, what we keep contained, what we choose not to speak. Silence, when it's voluntary and clear-minded, can be a sign of deep intelligence. More than that, it can be the most honorable response to stupidity. Michel de Montaigne, one of the great thinkers of the Renaissance, invites us to reflect on this quiet kind of power. In his essays, he suggests that silence, in certain moments, is the mark of someone who no longer needs to prove anything. And retreat, not as running away, but as a deliberate choice, can be one of the highest forms of self-respect. A word belongs half to the one who speaks, half to the one who hears, Montaigne. If the other half isn't willing to listen with real attention, is it even worth speaking? That's the question behind this lesson. When is silence wiser than speech? When is stepping away nobler than staying in the conversation? Montaigne didn't see silence as submission, but as inner strength, proof of self-control and self-sufficiency. Talking is easy. Talking is tempting. Talking is human. But staying quiet takes control. And above all, it takes a calm confidence that not everything deserves a response. In an era like ours, where everyone wants the last word, where debate has turned into entertainment, and speed is mistaken for intelligence, silence has become almost revolutionary. Staying silent isn't disappearing. It's refusing the ego game. It's stepping out of the fight without taking the bait. It's protecting your clarity in places where the noise has become unbearable. For Montaigne, retreat wasn't selfish isolation. It was care for the soul. He valued social life, yes, but he also knew there are moments when the world demands too much. Moments when conversations become repetitive, arguments run dry, and being around people creates more confusion than clarity. In those moments, stepping back isn't weakness, it's health. Mental, emotional, and philosophical health. I withdraw not to escape the world, but to find myself again. Montaigne. How many times do we stay in pointless arguments, toxic environments, or exhausting conversations because we're afraid that leaving will make us look weak? And how many times does that cost us peace, energy, and focus? A wise person knows when to stay and when to go. They understand that real value is found in preserved integrity, not in a win that cost you your calm. Stupidity, when confronted head-on, often pushes back harder. The more we try to convince the irrational, the more defensive it gets. Louder, more distorted, and often more stubborn. Montaigne saw this clearly. For him, some mistakes don't deserve a rebuttal. They deserve silence, because an obvious error, when it isn't fed, can expose itself. And in those cases, silence isn't avoidance, it's a mirror. When someone says something openly stupid and gets silence in return, something unsettling happens. The lack of response creates discomfort. The lack of a fight removes validation. And sometimes that discomfort teaches more than any argument. Even Socrates, known for endless questions, understood when to be silent. During his trial, accused unjustly, he answered calmly, but he didn't beg for mercy. And when he was condemned, he accepted the sentence with dignity. His final silence wasn't submission, it was loyalty to his philosophy. He would rather die faithful to what he believed than degrade himself trying to persuade people who had already made up their minds. That kind of silence is greatness. It's a quiet statement that personal integrity matters more than any attempt at persuasion. Today, the world demands instant opinions. It expects reactions. It pressures people to respond. And those who stay silent are often accused of being passive or cowardly. But silence isn't always running away. Sometimes silence is care. It's protecting your mind from fights that go nowhere. It's saving yourself for battles that actually matter. Social media, for example, is perfect ground for non-stop talking. But it can also be a place where silence becomes resistance, refusing the spectacle, refusing to feed the outrage machine. Montaigne would say, be selective with your voice, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. Not every discussion needs your opinion. Not every mistake deserves your energy. Not every provocation is worthy of your response. Another side of silence in Montaigne is its creative value. When we talk all the time, we stop hearing ourselves. We don't let ideas mature. We don't organize our thoughts. Silence, in that sense, isn't just the absence of noise, it's the presence of depth. Retreat, in turn, is the ideal setting for that inner listening. Thinking without pressure, feeling without interference, and reorganizing your mind in a world that constantly pulls you outward. People who never retreat, who never get quiet, risk living in constant reaction, never in creation. Silence is where ideas take root, where reason can grow away from urgency. Choosing silence when needed is personal power. It means, I choose where my energy goes. I choose what deserves my words. It's freeing yourself from the compulsion to respond, explain, correct, or win. And that is freedom. Montaigne lived in turbulent times, civil wars and religious conflict, and he understood that the mind needs pauses, refuges, zones of silence to stay clear. He teaches us that a truly wise person isn't someone who speaks all the time. It's someone who speaks at the right time and knows that often what isn't said teaches more than any speech. Finally, Silence can also be an ethical choice. When correcting someone would humiliate them, when joining a debate would legitimize something absurd, when responding would only feed hatred. In those moments, staying quiet is a form of care. It's a way of saying, I don't want to be part of this. Silence, then, becomes a language that speaks without shouting, communicates without invading, and teaches without forcing. Maybe the deepest kind of wisdom is admitting how much we still don't know, how often we mess up, how easily we fool ourselves, and how, even with study, reflection, and experience, foolishness still lives in us, quietly, or sometimes loudly. Diogenes of Sinope, the cynic philosopher, was a master at exposing that truth. With sarcasm, provocation, and a life that mocked fake, wise men, he reminds us of something uncomfortable. Anyone who thinks they're very smart has probably fallen into the most dangerous kind of foolishness, intellectual pride. I know that I know nothing is usually linked to Socrates, but Diogenes lived that idea in a more radical way. He didn't just admit ignorance, he threw it in the face of people who acted like they had it all figured out. He didn't write long treatises, he acted out contradictions. He walked through the streets with a lantern in broad daylight saying, I'm looking for an honest man. It was his way of saying, nobody is as wise as they think. We're all mixed up, in one way or another, with ignorance, error, and self-deception. While many people try to distance themselves from foolishness, building an image of authority, education, or logical superiority, Diogenes did the opposite. He got close to it. He looked foolishness straight in the face, not only in others, but in himself, and by recognizing it, he could laugh at it. That's the key point of this lesson. No human being is completely immune to being foolish. We can study it, criticize it, expose it, but it will always find a way to touch us. Sometimes through arrogance, sometimes through naivete, sometimes through our attachment to what we're sure about. And that's exactly why admitting your own ignorance is a sign of real intelligence. Wisdom isn't a finish line, it's a way of living. It's staying open. It's active humility. It's constantly revisiting what you think you know. Diogenes mocked academic philosophers who got stuck in theoretical fights, fancy debates, and argumentative vanity. He saw that not as wisdom, but as empty performance. For him, knowledge isn't something you show off. It's something you live with clarity. And that requires, first of all, the courage to admit your limits. Intellectual pride, the need to always be right, to be the smartest person in the room, is a subtle trap. It locks us inside our own certainty. It makes us deaf to complexity. It turns us into judges of the world while making us blind to our own flaws. And as Diogenes would put it, wisdom begins when you stop taking yourself so seriously. Admitting we're foolish in some ways isn't giving up on knowledge. It actually makes room for it, because the person who believes they already know everything stops learning. And the person who stops learning starts tripping, without noticing, because they think they're above mistakes. Foolishness doesn't always look like obvious ignorance. Sometimes it wears a suit, has degrees on the wall, and speaks confidently. It can live in classrooms, courtrooms, congresses, and universities. The problem isn't knowledge itself. It's identity-based attachment to knowledge. Real foolishness is often the unshakable certainty that you're right. It's refusing to reconsider, refusing to listen, refusing to change. It's making fun of someone else's mistake while being blind to your own. Diogenes made fun of that. He mocked the wise people of his time through extreme behavior, living like a beggar, sleeping in a barrel, making himself look ridiculous. Not because he thought it made him better, but because he wanted to tear down the theatre of pretension. He wanted to show that the wise image often hides fragility underneath. Recognizing that we're foolish in some ways isn't self-hate, it's clarity. It's understanding that knowledge is limited, that reason can fail, that emotions confuse us, that our environment shapes us. That mindset doesn't make us weak. It makes us open, and that makes us stronger. Because the person who accepts they might be wrong listens more, observes better, reacts less, and grows with more freedom. Diogenes wasn't pushing empty cynicism. He was pushing radical honesty against the ego's illusions. He didn't want us to stop seeking knowledge. He wanted to clear the path of the vanity that blocks real learning. How many times have we seen experts or respected authorities make public mistakes and refuse to admit it? How many times do brilliant people make foolish decisions because of vanity, pride, or selective blindness? That's the point. Knowing a lot doesn't prevent you from being wrong, and being wrong shouldn't be shame, it should be learning. But in our culture, mistakes are still treated like weakness. That pressure makes people pretend they know when they should be asking questions. Admitting ignorance in front of others takes courage, but it also builds trust, because humility makes room for truth. Diogenes knew how to laugh at himself, and that kind of laughter is freeing. It removes the burden of perfection. It strips away the mask of authority. It lets you be human, contradictory, limited, still growing. The clearest wisdom is the kind that can smile at its own mistakes, the kind that isn't obsessed with looking smart, the kind that knows that no matter how far we walk, there will always be more road ahead than steps we've taken. To be human is to make mistakes. To be wise is to laugh at it and keep trying. That could have been Diogenes' motto. If there's an antidote to foolishness, it isn't just accumulated knowledge. It's active self-criticism, a steady look inward, a willingness to revise your ideas, admit errors, and question your own certainty. And that self-criticism doesn't have to be harsh. It can be light, humorous, and generous, like Diogenes. He didn't hate fools. He just refused to pretend we weren't all a little foolish in some way. That's why his philosophy still feels so modern. It doesn't idealize intelligence. It humanizes it. In the end, recognizing that we're all foolish to some degree makes us more patient with others, less arrogant, less reactive. Because we remember that mistakes are part of the process. That awareness helps us avoid humiliating people who know less. It helps us listen to people who think differently. It helps us laugh at life's absurdities with a bit of distance, not out of indifference, but out of understanding. For Diogenes, the truly wise person isn't the one who separates themselves from the ignorant. It's the one who admits they're one of them, just trying to live with a little more clarity each day. If you've made it this far, thank you so much. Reflecting on human foolishness, and especially our own, takes courage, humility, and a real desire to grow. I hope these philosophical lessons don't stay stuck in theory, but actually find a place in your everyday life, in your relationships, your choices, and the way you think and feel about the world. If this video helped you, don't forget to hit like. It really helps the channel reach more people. Subscribe so you don't miss the next videos. Always with deep, practical, and thought-provoking reflections. Share this with someone you think could benefit from these ideas. Sometimes a great conversation starts with a video. And of course, leave a comment below. Which lesson hit you the hardest? Which one have you lived through yourself? Let's keep the conversation going in the comments. And before you go, stick around on the channel. There's a lot more content waiting for you here. Philosophy really can change the way we live, and it always starts, as it should, with a good question. See you in the next video.